And greetings, friends. Today I want to talk to you about Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 38 through 40, that says this. Ye have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil. But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. Now, a lot of people take this to mean that here is an example of Jesus Christ of Nazareth doing away with the Old Testament law. Is that true? Well, to understand what Jesus Christ is saying here, we must understand the context. And in verse 20, we can understand the context and that Jesus is not dealing with the law itself, but the interpreters of the law. Notice what it says in verse 20. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. So Christ is dealing with the interpreters of the law, not the law itself. Notice in verse 21 it says, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time. So he's talking here about the scribes and the Pharisees. You've heard what has been said of them of old time, and then he would quote the law and their misinterpretation of the law. That's why it says here in verse 38, you have heard that it has been said. By who? The interpreters of the law, the scribes and the Pharisees. Then he says, but I say unto you. This is the true meaning of what the law is really saying. This is what Jesus Christ of Nazareth is saying in this context. Now notice, it says, for I say unto you that except your righteousness, what is the righteousness of a Christian? Well, it's God's law. Romans the 8th chapter, verse 4. And let me just go over there right quickly to show you what the righteousness of a Christian is. This is just one example of many. Romans 8 and verse 4. It says that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. That's a Christian. Who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. So the righteousness of the law is fulfilled in us. That is the righteousness of a Christian. Shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. What is the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees? Well, that is the commandments and the traditions of men, and not the commandments of God. And you can read that fully in Mark the 7th chapter, verses 5 through 9, or Matthew the 15th chapter. Go there right quickly. Matthew 15. And it says here of the scribes and the Pharisees, verse 1, that were of Jerusalem, saying, why do you disciples transgress the traditions of the elders? That's their righteousness, not the righteousness of God, but the traditions of men. For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. And Jesus answered and said to them, why do you transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? So this is the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, the commandments of men, as it says this. In vain, verse 9, but in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So that's the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. So here Christ is dealing with the interpretation of God's law and how they twist the scriptures and add their tradition, their commandment into it. And it's, of course, it says, as it says back in Matthew the 15th chapter, that their commandments, the commandment of God has none effect by their commandments, their traditions. So, now that we understand this context, notice what Jesus Christ is saying here. It says, you have heard that it has been said, verse 38, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, now notice, this is the interpretation of the scribes and the Pharisees, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. What is the context? Notice what it says here. In Gill's commentary, resist not the evil. It means personal vengeance. We must not render evil for evil or repay him in the same way. See James, the 5th chapter, verse 6. Clark's commentary also agrees. Our Lord's meaning is, do not repel one's outrage by another. So here Jesus Christ is speaking of personal vengeance. It says here, whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek. What is the reaction? If somebody smites you on the right cheek, what is the reaction? Somebody hit you. What are you looking for? Personal vengeance. It's not talking about self-defense. Self-defense is preventing someone from smiting you on the right cheek. It's not talking about self-defense. It's talking about somebody smiting you in the right cheek, and you're looking for what? You're looking for personal vengeance. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees took the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and they twisted it around, interpreted the meaning, saying that if somebody smites you because of this law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, you can go out and you can seek personal vengeance. And Jesus says unto you that Christ said to them, resist not the evil. What is the evil? Personal vengeance. And the Bible plainly says that you should not seek personal vengeance on anyone. And of course, breaking the law of God, is evil. Resist not the evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. Christ is saying, do not take personal vengeance, as we see in the scriptures. Leviticus 19th chapter, verse 18. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as yourself. I am the eternal. Proverbs, the 20th chapter, verse 22. Say not thou, I will recompense evil. So the Bible, the Old Testament says, don't take personal vengeance. The scribes and the Pharisees took the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and says, no, you can take personal vengeance. That was their interpretation. The righteousness of the Pharisees. But the righteousness of Christians, the righteousness of God, says, no, you don't take personal vengeance. And what is the context of eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? What is the true context? Well, notice Exodus 21st chapter, verse 22. This is where we find it. It says this, if men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follows, he shall be surely punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him. And he shall pay as the judges determine. The judges determine the execution. Who are the judges? Well, when you look at the examples in the Bible, James Strong and McClintock Cyclopedia says the judges are the rulers of the nation. The judges are basically the government in Israel. Notice Deuteronomy 16:18. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the eternal thy God giveth you throughout your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. So the eye for an eye, the tooth for a tooth, only the judges can execute the punishment for crime. And the scribes and the Pharisees took that, twisted it around, and says, no, you can take personal vengeance on someone. And the Bible doesn't say that. The eye for an eye is only for the judges, as the judges determine. It says, as the judges determine, if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. As the judges determine. That's the context, not personal vengeance. The context is the judges are allowed to go out and execute vengeance for a crime that has been committed. Notice it says here, a divine sentence is in the lips of the king. His mouth transgresses not in judgment. Proverbs, the 16th chapter, verse 10. Only the king can execute, the government can execute vengeance on a crime that is committed. Not one going out and taking personal vengeance. God does not allow personal vengeance in Israel. And the law of God is clear that personal vengeance should not be taken on someone. And Jesus is basically saying the same thing here. Resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Don't seek personal vengeance. The law says so. The Bible plainly says so. Here I'll show you another example. In Romans, the 12th chapter, following the law of God, the Apostle Paul says this, recompense, verse 17 of Romans 12. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Verse 19, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, like we read back in the book of Leviticus, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the eternal. God repays because God is king. Bible plainly says God is king. And God is king, and he also gave the same powers to earthly kings as well. Notice Romans the 13th chapter, verse 1. It says, let every soul be subject unto higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God, talking about the government. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, that's the government, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. The rulers execute vengeance on evil, on crime. Only the rulers can do it. Only the rulers can put people to death. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? You should. If you commit a crime, you better be afraid of the government, because the government can execute vengeance on you. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. If you keep the law of the land, well, then they will praise you because you're keeping the law of the land. And you're allowed to go free and do what you want because you're keeping the law of the land. For he, that's the ruler, is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. This is the ruler. He bears not the sword in vain. And he says you should be afraid. Because if you commit a crime in the land, he has every right to execute vengeance on you, put you to death, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. For he is a minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So that is the context. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is only as the judges determine the execution. Only the judges can put people to death. The scribes and the Pharisees twisted it around and said, oh no, you can take personal vengeance on someone because the law says so, and they took it out of context and they didn't interpret it correctly. Jesus Christ of Nazareth interpreted it correctly. He says, don't take personal vengeance on anyone. They are twisting this law around. This is your righteousness. This interpretation is the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, but your righteousness is what the law says. That only the judges, the government can execute. Only the government can execute vengeance on someone who has committed a crime. And you don't take personal vengeance on anyone as the law says. That's what Jesus Christ is basically saying. So to say that these scriptures prove that God's law is done away is just another Bible misconception.